The Stonewall riots in New York City were a flashpoint in civil rights history. 50 years ago, gay, lesbian, trans, and other gender nonconforming people rioted at a bar called the Stonewall Inn after police raided the club. The New York Public Library has one of the largest collections of artifacts from that tumultuous time, which is now being displayed in a major exhibit. NewsHour Weekend's Ivette Feliciano spoke with the exhibit's curator about what is widely seen as the birth of the modern-day fight for LGBTQ rights.
In its exhibit titled Love and Resistance, Stonewall 50, the New York Public Library is marking the momentous anniversary with never-before-seen photos and artifacts from an era that defined one of America's great fights for human rights.
These are really some of the first demonstrations in the United States for LGBTQ rights.
Jason Bauman curated the exhibit and is coordinator of the library's LGBTQ initiative. He says the events at New York City's Stonewall Inn undoubtedly changed the face of gay and trans culture and activism. The week-long uprising that began on June 28, 1969, brought to light systemic crackdowns on a culture that was not seen as socially acceptable.
These kinds of raids were fairly routine at these clubs in the Village in the 1960s. Many of the bars that catered to gay and lesbian and also transgender patrons were illegal clubs because a bar could be shut down or lose its liquor license in the 1960s in New York if they had gay or transgender patrons. Demonstrations in '65 at
The exhibition begins during the period before the historic rebellion, in 1965.
You'd had this almost a decade of this political activism. There were also a number of riots before Stonewall around the country, at Compton's Cafeteria, at the Black Cat, and other establishments that leads up to it.
One of the main attractions of the exhibit, rare photos by noted photographers Kay Tobin LaHusin and Diana Davies, who captured everyday life.
So often multiracial, multi-ethnic couples, often also older couples, to show that LGBT relationships aren't these fleeting, illegal, clandestine things, but really that you could make a life together.
Another section shows photos of pioneering demonstrations like this one from a 1965 march in front of the White House.
So you have these activists from the 1950s and 60s who had a very kind of conservative appearance, who were often trying to find ways to slowly work within the system.
But the exhibit demonstrates a change in the tone of LGBTQ activists after Stonewall, particularly in San Francisco and New York City's Greenwich Village.
You have this new generation that joins, and these younger people who were on the streets of the Village really have a much more confrontational politics.
Featured in the exhibit are activists Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, two transgender women of color who in 1970 co-founded STAR, or the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries. The organization addressed the concerns of low-income and homeless queer and trans ethnic minorities.
People debate about this, but it seems fairly clear from people's memories of Stonewall that it was actually transgender women of color who were really on the front lines of the conflict with the police those first 3 days of Stonewall. Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera were on the front lines of all the demonstrations in the 1970s. Before them, you didn't have this kind of street activism. They really had a very broad intersectional political agenda.
This new wave of activism emboldened thousands across the country to express themselves. Dozens of organizations formed, including the Gay Liberation Front and Radical Lesbians. The exhibit also features magazines that existed before Stonewall that boldly brought people out of the shadows.
They start putting real happy lesbians on the cover. Before that, lesbians would be depicted as killers, as mentally ill, as criminal, right, or suicidal. So to have this happy, out, well-adjusted human being, and full human being on the cover of a magazine as a lesbian is totally revolutionary.
Another section titled Bars features invitations to dances, bars, and discos that blossomed after Stonewall.
So you see in the activism, part of it is creating alternative nightlife, of creating these dances and all of these kinds of different alternatives to the police entrapment in the bars. So it is about creating these spaces for freedom.
To recreate this era, the library hosted a cabaret night in April with a performance by the iconic singer and comedian Justin Vivian Bond.
I called my mother up. I said, "Mom, we're gonna be in Very Fair." She said, "Is that a gay magazine?"
Also featured were a younger generation of activists and entertainers.
My sisters are literally dying. My sisters are literally dying.
LGBTQ history really isn't taught in schools. They aren't being brought up getting this history. We're often given this kind of narrative where Stonewall sort of like this grand beginning of gay liberation that starts, and then all of a sudden then there's gay marriage, and we're not given all of the steps in between. And I think the real lessons from all of that is that our society changed because people became active politically. It can inspire people today to really realize that our society changed because people got out of their houses and into the streets.